What if the stories you've heard about World War II are only half the truth? Beneath the official history lies a darker layer, disturbing tales buried by silence, erased from textbooks, and whispered by survivors who were never supposed to speak. These aren't myths. These are the hidden files of war, sealed, forgotten, or deliberately destroyed. And once you hear them, you can't unhear them. Snow drifted in slow, silent flurries across the smoldering skeletons of Stalingrad, and the city breathed with the groans of steel and dying men. It was January 1943, and the siege had reached a brutal crescendo. Shells no longer surprised anyone. Hunger became routine. But deep within the chaos, on a ruined street corner near Red Square, smoke rose not from war, but from an oven. Ivan Morozov, once a humble baker with a laugh like thunder and fingers thick as sausages, had lived all his 57 years in the city. His bakery had been crushed by German artillery in the fall, but he stayed. Not to fight with a rifle, he was too old and arthritic for that, but with flour and fire. He reopened the shattered remnants of his bakery, using a blackened stone oven that had somehow survived the shelling. He named it the Mouth of the Bear, half-jokingly, because in Stalingrad even humor had to be grim. Ivan's bread was not bread as the world once knew it. He baked with sawdust, crushed potato skins, sunflower husks, and whatever trace amounts of flour the quartermasters could spare him. Sometimes he ground up wallpaper paste. But his loaves were warm, solid, and they filled a soldier's belly more than hope alone could. Rumors swirled around Ivan, that his bread could make a man forget frostbite, that a single slice had once revived a comrade on death's door. The Red Army unofficially adopted Ivan. Commissars allowed him access to food scrapings, the engineers gave him coal for his oven, and wounded men told tales of the bread bear as if he were a folk legend. Each morning, as the sun failed to break through the smoke-choked sky, Ivan lit the oven, said a short prayer to his dead wife, and baked until he collapsed. His hands, cracked and bleeding, never stopped kneading. He spoke little, but his actions were loud. Once, during the coldest week of January, Ivan dragged a sled through 3 kilometers of open fire zone to deliver hot bread to a trench filled with trapped soldiers. Bullets rang against buildings. German snipers were active. Yet Ivan trudged on, muttering under his breath, "Boys can't fight with air in their guts." A soldier named Yuri, now old and blind in the interview this fictional documentary builds itself upon, recalls the moment Ivan appeared at their trench. "We thought he was a ghost," Yuri says, chuckling. "He handed me a half-loaf still steaming. I cried harder than when my brother died. It was the only warm thing I touched that winter." One of Ivan's most daring acts came in February. Intelligence had come in that German soldiers were advancing from the river, and civilians were evacuating into Soviet-held tunnels. Instead of escaping, Ivan loaded a sack with loaves and went toward the front, giving bread to every child, mother, and dying man he passed. When asked why he risked it, he only said, "The dying still deserve breakfast." That was Ivan, a man whose courage had nothing to do with bullets. But the war had no patience for kindness. On March 1st, after weeks of relative quiet, German artillery launched a retaliatory barrage against the city center. The bakery took a direct hit. It was the 3rd time his building had been struck, but this time it collapsed entirely. Firefighters found Ivan beneath the rubble, arms locked around his oven as though protecting it like a baby. He was alive, barely. His left leg had been crushed, his ribs broken, his hands scorched. They carried him to a makeshift field hospital, where medics tried to save him. But infection moved faster than morphine, and on March 5th, Ivan Morozov died, muttering through a fever dream of dough and rising crust. What he left behind was greater than any single loaf. After the war, veterans would speak of him like they spoke of Zaitsev or Chukov. A plaque was nailed to the new bakery built over the ruins in 1951. It read, "Here stood Ivan Morozov, who fed the soul of Stalingrad when no one else could." In this fictional documentary's framing, the camera lingers on a black and white photo of Ivan, dust-covered, standing beside his oven, holding a loaf with cracked fingers and a faint smile. Overlaid is a quote falsely attributed to one of the soldiers: "He didn't bake bread. He baked defiance." The train was scheduled to depart Lyon at 4:15 on the morning of July 3, 1943. Its official manifest recorded 263 passengers, men, women, children, all classified under the Nazi regime as undesirables. Jews, political dissidents, and a handful of Roma were rounded up by the milice and loaded into sealed cattle cars under the watchful eyes of German soldiers. Destination: Auschwitz-Birkenau. But the train never arrived. It passed through Dijon without issue, reported at the Beaune checkpoint, but vanished somewhere between Chagny and Chalon-sur-Saône. No wreckage was found. No bodies. No survivors. It simply disappeared. For decades, the mystery of the ghost train of Vichy haunted war historians. Was it destroyed in secret? Attacked by resistance fighters? Lost in the bureaucratic black hole of war? It wasn't until the early 2000s, during a renovation of a long-abandoned monastery in the Burgundy countryside, that pieces of the puzzle began to surface. Hidden beneath a stone chapel floor was a rusted metal box. Inside, forged Nazi travel documents, identity cards, and a hand-drawn railway map labeled Operation Minuet. Alongside them lay the personal diary of Père Antoine Lacroix, a Dominican priest believed to have died in 1944. The diary entries, written in shaky French script, detail the conspiracy that rerouted the ghost train and spared 263 lives. According to Lacroix, the plan began with a railway dispatcher named Jean-Marc Faure, a former communist who'd buried his politics under a Vichy uniform. He'd watched train after train vanish eastward, their passengers never returning. Consumed by guilt, he approached Lacroix through back channels, and together they hatched an idea so dangerous it bordered on suicidal: steal a deportation train. They enlisted the help of Elise Montaigne, a young nurse and courier for the French resistance. Through her, they contacted a cell in Macon known as Les Ombres. Using coded messages delivered via church bulletins and hospital records, they confirmed the next scheduled deportation train and began to prepare. Every member knew that discovery meant torture, execution, or worse. The plan relied on precision. The train would leave Lyon as scheduled. At Chagny, Faure would switch tracks under cover of night, sending the train west instead of northeast. A team disguised as Vichy rail workers would intercept the train at an abandoned spur in the forest of Le Chêne Noir, disable the German guards with chloroform, and evacuate the passengers on foot through the woods to a hidden monastic retreat. And somehow, impossibly, it worked. The diary describes the operation in breathless detail. The German commander was a drunk, easy to subdue. The guards, lulled by routine, never saw the ambush coming. When they awoke hours later, their weapons were gone, their boots stripped, and their train filled only with empty cars and forged documents suggesting a different destination. By the time the Nazis began their manhunt, the real passengers were deep underground, hidden in tunnels used by monks since the 14th century. Of the 263 refugees, only one died during the escape, a woman named Bronia Klein, who collapsed from exhaustion in the forest. The rest were fed, clothed, and given false identities. Over the next year, they were smuggled in small groups through neutral Switzerland, many eventually reaching Spain or Portugal. But there was a cost. The Gestapo caught wind of the conspiracy weeks later. Lacroix was arrested in September and never seen again. Faure was executed by firing squad. Elise was tortured at Montluc prison, her body dumped in the Rhône. The monastery was burned to the ground in a reprisal raid. Every trace of the operation was meant to be erased. Yet it wasn't. In 1962, a gravestone was found in the forest near Chalon. It bore no name, only the inscription, Pour ceux qui l'on sauve, for those we saved. Locals thought it referred to fallen partisans. But now, it is believed to be the burial site of Bronia Klein and a quiet memorial by those who survived. Interviews with descendants of the refugees, fictionalized for this story, describe lives rebuilt in Canada, Argentina, and Palestine. A dentist in Toronto. A violinist in Tel Aviv. A bricklayer in Buenos Aires who never spoke of the war but wept every July. None of them knew who saved them. Only that one night, the train they were on veered off course and vanished into the mist. In the closing moments of this imagined documentary, A haunting piano theme plays over slow footage of rusted tracks consumed by forest. A narrator reads from Père Lacroix's final diary entry. "We are all passengers. Some are bound for death, some for hope. Tonight, we lay new tracks, not in steel, but in defiance." The village of Sainte-Marguerite-sur-Mer sat on the edge of the Normandy cliffs like a forgotten child clutching the hem of France. In 1944, it was a place of cows, cabbages, and silence, until the war began whispering through its hedgerows. Émile Fournier was 11, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken. He and his younger sister Colette, age 9, lived in a creaky farmhouse with their grandmother after their father was conscripted and their mother died in the Caen bombings. Their only friend was Jacques Vasseur, the mayor's son, who had a lisp and a wooden leg from an accident with a plow horse. Together, they formed a trio of quiet watchers, observers of the strange world falling apart around them. In the spring of 1944, Sainte Marguerite changed. The Germans who'd once lounged outside the café playing cards grew tenser. Trucks rumbled in at night. Barbed wire sprouted along the beach. One morning, the children discovered the marshes near the dunes had been mined. They weren't told why. No one was. Then came Mr. Henry. He arrived in May, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a beard the color of cigarette ash. He claimed to be a beekeeper, said he was renting a cottage for peace and pollination. But the children knew something was off. He didn't speak like a local. His French was too clean, too careful. He never tended his hives, but he did spend a lot of time sketching the cliffs and scribbling into a black notebook. One afternoon, Émile followed him and saw Mr. Henry, whose real name, we learn later, was Captain Malcolm Henry of the British SOE, adjusting a strange metal device hidden inside a log. The boy didn't report him. Instead, he asked, "Are you making a bomb?" Mr. Henry smiled. "I'm making a map." From that day on, the children became his eyes. Émile noted the times when German patrols changed. Colette sketched the layout of the machine gun nests with her crayons. Jacques, with his limp, pretended to be slow and useless but managed to sneak into the command post and memorize call signs. In exchange, Mr. Henry gave them chocolate, real chocolate wrapped in silver foil. But more than sweets, he gave them purpose. The children never fully grasped the scale of what they were helping to plan. They didn't know about Operation Neptune, or Eisenhower, or the fleets assembling in Portsmouth. They only knew Mr. Henry needed them. That was enough. On the night of June 5th, Colette was awakened by a strange rumble in the sky. She ran barefoot to the window and saw the horizon pulsing with lights, flashes of distant thunder that never stopped. Ships. Hundreds of them. By dawn, Sainte Marguerite was on fire. The Americans landed at Omaha Beach. The village, nestled between two key bluffs, became a battlefield in hours. Mortar shells shredded cabbage fields. The town hall was blown apart. The air stank of burning fuel and churned earth. Amid the chaos, the children looked for Mr. Henry. They found him near the church, blood running down his temple, clutching a broken radio. He ordered them to go home, to stay hidden, but Émile refused. "We helped start this," he said. "We're not hiding now." Together, they dragged Mr. Henry into the crypt beneath the church. From there, he finished transmitting the final coordinates of German reinforcements along the ridge. Intel that, according to fictional documents later, discovered by historians, saved the 29th Infantry Division from a deadly ambush. Jacques, despite his limp, ran across open ground to warn a U.S. patrol about an incoming artillery position. He didn't make it back. Jacques Vasseur died a hero at age 10. The next day, Sainte Marguerite was liberated. Mr. Henry vanished into the chaos. The children never saw him again. After the war, Émile and Colette moved to Rouen with their grandmother. They grew up quietly, carried the weight of that summer in their bones. They never bragged. They rarely spoke of it. But every June 6th, they returned to the village and left flowers by the church crypt, and at a small wooden cross just beyond the fields, where Jacques had fallen. Years later, in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, a letter was found, never sent. It was written by Malcolm Henry in July 1945, addressed to E.F., wherever he may be. It read, "They were not just children. They were scouts, saboteurs, messengers. In the days before the invasion, I trusted them more than any adult. In the end, they understood better than most what freedom costs." Today, the story of the Sainte Marguerite children lives on only in fragments, in local legends, in a faded mural in the rebuilt town hall, and in the memories of a war that shaped the world through small, invisible acts of bravery. Istanbul in 1943 was a city of veils, silk and smoke, lies and neutrality. Officially, Turkey was not a participant in the Second World War. Unofficially, it was a chessboard, and the pieces were spies. British, German, Soviet, American, and Italian agents brushed shoulders in tea shops and shared coded glances in hammams. The war's bloodshed seemed far away, but in truth, it was boiling beneath the Bosphorus. At the center of it was Operation Windglass. The operation began with a single intercepted message, a shortwave transmission sent from Ankara to Berlin, decrypted by British cryptanalysts stationed in Cairo. The message was fragmentary but terrifying, references to bulk fuel movement to Tobruk, Greek sabotage resistance compromised, and a cryptic phrase, "The Raven will fly at dusk." MI6 immediately suspected they had a leak. A high-level one. A mole. The codename for the unknown Axis informant became Der Rabe, the Raven. Evelyn Hart, a 38-year-old intelligence officer known for her cold logic and unnerving memory, was assigned to lead the hunt. Fluent in Turkish and Arabic, Hart was posted to Istanbul under the guise of a cultural attaché. Her real mission, find the Raven before the next Allied convoy was ambushed, or worse. Windglass, her operation, was named after a Turkish proverb, "To see the wind, watch the glass." In other words, find the invisible by watching its effect on the visible. Hart began by building profiles on everyone with access to Allied logistics inside Turkey. Consulate staff, railway administrators, refinery workers, even translators. She cross-referenced fuel shipments and false intel drops with local movements of suspected German agents. But Der Rabe stayed ahead. Every time she planted false intel, the Axis ignored it. Every time she made a move, something in her circle shifted. Someone close was feeding information directly to Berlin. In early October, a tanker en route to supply Montgomery's 8th Army was torpedoed off the Libyan coast, hours after Evelyn had signed off on its route. Then, a break. A Turkish naval officer sympathetic to the Allies approached Hart in secret. He had found a discrepancy in port records. An Allied-coded fuel shipment had been diverted by an emergency order signed not by the British, but by a forged diplomatic seal. The paper bore a watermark used only by the American consulate. It wasn't a Turk. The Raven was one of theirs. Hart turned her attention inward. Over the next 10 days, she orchestrated an elaborate trap. A bogus set of invasion plans for the Dodecanese was circulated among consulate staff, sealed in a red folder marked, "For General Graham's eyes only." She watched. She waited. 48 hours later, German radio relayed a near-identical plan to Italian command in Rhodes. Hart had her suspect, a smooth-talking diplomat named William Avery, recently transferred from Lisbon. Known for his charm, fondness for chess, and Turkish mistress, Avery had worked hard to appear harmless. But Hart saw the truth in the reflection. His social grace masked cold calculation. Rather than arrest him, she tailed him. She followed him through the twisting alleys of Galata, through hookah lounges and horse tracks, until one rainy evening he passed an envelope to a flower vendor near the Spice Bazaar. The vendor, as it turned out, was a courier for the Abwehr, the German intelligence agency. Hart moved quickly. Avery was detained in secret by Turkish authorities working with the Allies. Under interrogation, he admitted nothing. No name, no confession. But he wore a ring. A simple silver one, with a raven etched into its side. Hart knew he was the one. But proving it publicly would trigger a diplomatic scandal between the UK and the US. Instead, they arranged a quiet transfer. Avery was put on a boat headed for Alexandria. The ship never reached port. It struck a German mine and sank. Or so the reports claimed. In reality, Avery was quietly executed, his body never found. The Raven was dead. But Operation Windglass did not end there. In Avery's Istanbul apartment, hidden inside a hollowed-out atlas, was a black ledger. It contained coded entries detailing payments from Swiss bank accounts, names of Turkish informants, and, most disturbing of all, a plan to destabilize Soviet influence in the Caucasus using manufactured Kurdish uprisings. Hart handed the ledger to the Soviets. It bought them 3 more months of Turkish neutrality. Years later, Evelyn Hart disappeared. Some say she retired to a vineyard in Cyprus. Others believe she was killed during a Cold War purge of compromised agents. In the archives of British intelligence, her file ends with a single handwritten line, "She saw the wind." Today, a forgotten plaque at the old British consulate in Istanbul reads, "Asterisk, to those who served in silence." Asterisk. Operation Windglass remains classified. But its echo can be found in every tale of shadows that followed. The crackle of static filled the bunker, drowning out the echo of artillery beyond the broken walls. For 6 months, Thomas Lew had broadcast from a hole in the earth. His voice, low and clear, crossed mountains and oceans on waves of static, telling the world what others tried to bury. Born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants, Thomas had grown up between languages, between cultures. He was fluent in both English and Mandarin, and after Pearl Harbor, he volunteered for the U.S. Army's Psychological Operations Unit. In 1942, he was embedded as a war correspondent in China. By 1944, he was alone in the ruins of Nanking, once a capital, now a graveyard, after the city was reoccupied by the Imperial Japanese Army in a brutal resurgence. He had refused extraction. Thomas knew what happened the last time Japan took Nanking. He'd read the reports, tens of thousands raped, murdered, buried in trenches. His job was simple, report. But Thomas saw the power of a voice. He believed in words as weapons, in truth as a form of resistance. So when the last American supply line collapsed, he dragged his field radio into the basement of an old Catholic school and began to speak. The broadcasts were short, always at night. "This is Lew. I am still here." He described what he saw, the scorched temples, the starving orphans, the streets where screams once echoed and now held only silence. But he didn't just report, he recited poetry. He read lines from Walt Whitman and Li Bai, alternating between English and Chinese. His voice became ritual, comfort, resistance. Allied planes flying over Burma would tune in. Chinese partisans used his coordinates to triangulate enemy movements. Japanese commanders tried to jam him but failed. The signal was too slippery, the source too elusive. He was never meant to last. But he did. In December 1944, during what would become his final month on air, he began broadcasting coded messages. They were subtle, references to river tides, weather patterns, numbers disguised as lines from Tang poetry. He was helping to coordinate a surge in guerrilla resistance movements across Jiangsu province, while pretending to recite elegies for lost dynasties. A Japanese patrol discovered the broadcast signal one night during a sweep. They surrounded the ruins, found the antenna, traced it to the bunker. But when they burst in, it was empty. Only the radio remained, humming softly, playing a recording of Thomas's own voice reading from a Chinese folktale about a blind man who saw more clearly than kings. The official story was that Thomas was captured and executed. But no body was found. Years later, American soldiers liberated a POW camp in Zhejiang and found a wall covered in etched poetry. The carvings were signed with an English L. A Chinese partisan captured in 1945 swore that Lew had escaped, that he'd been living in the hills disguised as a monk, still broadcasting on a handmade transmitter powered by bicycle. The truth remains a mystery. His broadcasts stopped in January 1945. The last message was barely audible beneath the static. "I have nothing left to send but my voice. If you can hear me, remember Nanking. Remember us." The war ended months later. Post-war, in both China and the United States, Thomas Lou's story slipped into obscurity. He was never officially honored. His reports were deemed non-standard by Allied command. But those who heard him, soldiers, prisoners, partisans, spoke of his voice like a beacon in the dark. In 1986, an elderly radio operator from the Flying Tigers wrote an article in an obscure military journal, recalling Lou's final broadcasts. That article sparked renewed interest. Historians and amateur radio archivists searched for recordings, finding fragments, warped tapes, magnetic reels with whispers of his voice beneath the static. Today, a small stone memorial stands in Nanking, funded not by governments but by private donors. It bears no dates, no military rank. Just a single line etched in both English and Chinese. He stayed on the air. You've just heard the stories they never wanted you to find. Pieces of a war far more complex, more horrifying, and more human than we were ever told. But the question remains, how many more lie buried, waiting to be uncovered? Truth has a cost, and now that you know, the silence becomes your burden too.